Hello, my name is Benjamin McKay, and I will be your affirmative today.
My name's Mayfield. I'll be your negative speaker today. All right.
All right, so is everyone ready? All right, then I will begin. In our United States Declaration of Independence, our predecessors declared many powerful words and truths. One of these truths, and perhaps one of the most foundational to the founding of this nation, also serves as the structure and cornerstone of my case as the affirmative today. And this truth is, quote, all men are created equal, end quote. Every person is entitled to equal opportunity, the same individual rights, and impartial justice, because all are equal. It is my belief that governments valuing fair trade above free trade when they conflict best upholds our duty to impartial justice. And therefore, as the affirmative today, I stand resolved. When in conflict, governments should value fair trade above free trade. Now, first, we need to define some of our key terms today, starting with that of fair trade. Fair trade is defined by English Oxford Living Dictionaries as, quote, trade between companies in developed countries and producers in developing countries in which fair prices are paid to the producers, end quote. Now, free trade is also defined by English Oxford Living Dictionaries as, quote, international trade left to its natural course without tariffs, quotas, or other restrictions, end quote. Now, let's establish some framework for this debate today. In the resolution, it states, when in conflict, governments should value fair trade above free trade. And there are two key things to notice here. The first is the phrase, governments should value. This means we are discussing this issue today from the perspective of government. It's an issue of governmental decision. And secondly, we see the term when in conflict. Now, conflict is defined by English Oxford Living Dictionaries as, quote, a serious incompatibility between two or more opinions, principles, or interests, end quote. This means that we are discussing which one, fair trade or free trade, governments should value or uphold over the other when they are at odds with one another and a choice must be made between the two. So, should governments leave the market unrestricted and allow unfair prices to be paid, or should the government restrict the international market in order to ensure fair prices? Which one will they uphold above the other, fair trade or free trade? Now, to make this decision, we need to establish our value, or what we see as most important. And that value that I would like to provide for us today is the value of justice. In today's round, we can decide which one government should uphold, fair trade or free trade, by discussing and establishing which one does a better job of upholding our end goal or value of justice. And I have two reasons why justice should be our main end goal in today's debate. The first is that justice is the most valuable thing. Whether it comes to riches, general welfare, or even being safe, ultimately justice is the most powerful and most important thing that governments can strive for. And secondly, justice is obligational. It is never permissible to do something morally wrong to get something that we want, and therefore justice must always come first, even before things like prosperity. Now, with this on the table, I'd like to move on to my one main argument for you today. My one main argument for why fair trade truly does achieve justice. And that is ultimately my main contention. When in conflict, fair trade above free trade best upholds justice. When in conflict, fair trade above free trade best upholds justice. And I have three main points under this main argument, three main premises that sort of illustrate my argument. And the first premise is premise A. To uphold justice, we must uphold impartiality. To uphold justice, we must uphold impartiality. I think it can go without saying that if we do not treat people fairly and equally, we are not being just. Once again, I brought up that quote from one of our founding documents saying, quote, all men are created equal, end quote. I don't think that the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., or the movement to give women the right to vote illustrate that it's okay to treat people unequally. Everything in our history and everything we know about justice tells us that to be just, we must uphold impartiality. And this leads us to my second premise, premise B. To uphold impartiality, we must stop exploitation. To uphold impartiality, we must stop exploitation. Now, it is not enough for governments to simply uphold people equally. It's not enough for governments to simply avoid showing favoritism. Men are corrupt, and men will exploit, take advantage, and hurt others to really bring advantage to themselves if they are uninhibited. It's because of this reason that governments are instituted, to protect men and to stop them from exploiting and harming one another. Therefore, to uphold impartiality, we must stop exploitation. We have to hold people accountable with governmental authority. And this leads me to my third premise, premise C. To stop exploitation, we must restrict trade and ensure fair prices. To stop exploitation, we must restrict trade and ensure fair prices. Now, what I'm not arguing today is that we shut down trade. I'm arguing that governments should impose a policy in which people are not allowed to exploit one another when they trade. Now, how do we know if someone is being exploited? Well, I would argue that someone is being exploited when they are not offered a reasonable price, what we would consider a fair price. And we can tell whether or not it's fair by looking to the current market conditions, supply and demand, and seeing whether that price matches up with what the market says a certain product is worth. If someone is refusing to pay that price and trying to exploit someone else, that injustice must be stopped. Therefore, to uphold justice, we must uphold fair trade and affirm the resolution.
All right. You ready? All right, let's get started. So I just have a couple questions about your case today. So first, talking a bit about your definition of fair trade, we can agree that it's essentially paying fair prices to producers in general.
It's the idea of trade between companies in developed countries and producers in developing countries. It's primarily looking at those in developing countries, but yes.
Okay, and it's an international form of trade.
Yes.
Okay, so again, moving on to free trade, we can agree this is definitely an international form of trade.
Yes.
Okay, so underneath free trade, if a government imposes a domestic policy, that wouldn't be in conflict with free trade, correct?
No, it would not.
Okay, so any domestic restrictions on trade are okay underneath free trade. We can agree.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
It would only be international regulations.
Okay, so if there's exploitation within a specific country, and that country's government wants to take care of that exploitation, they wouldn't necessarily have to implement fair trade in order to do so. Is that correct?
Well, if the exploitation was on a domestic level, yes.
Okay.
But in our resolution, we're talking about international exploitation.
Okay, so if a producer or a consumer in one country is exploiting a producer in another country, that's when the government takes action, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and which government would take action in that situation? The country of the producer or the country of the consumer?
Well, both of them would take an action in a sense, but essentially it's the idea that governments will stop their own citizens from exploiting people of other countries. And the countries that are developing countries would sort of back that up and would essentially side with that and go along with that regulation and allow it to take place.
Okay, awesome. So you had two reasons why justice was the best value, and one of them was it's very valuable, obviously. The other one was it was obligational. Could you explain your point there a bit?
Yes, so when we're talking about justice, it's important to realize that it's never permissible to violate justice for any other thing, even if that other thing is good. Justice always comes first.
Okay, so justice is primary. Got it. Okay, so now talking a little bit about your syllogism, basically, with your arguments there underneath your first contention. So I would ask you a question. Where would this fit in to your syllogism if fair trade, while stopping exploitation and therefore upholding impartiality, is somehow partial in some other way?
Well, if fair trade was truly partial in some other way, it would really come down to really the last premise. In order to uphold impartiality, we must restrict trade and uphold fair prices. The third premise would ultimately be where that would.
I think your third premise was to stop exploitation, we must uphold fair prices.
Yes. I'm sorry. The first premise talking about upholding impartiality, stopping exploitation, and through that we would have to uphold fair prices.
Okay, cool. So if we were to say that fair trade would stop exploitation, but at the same time it would be partial, then your second premise would be false? Is that correct?
Well, I suppose that it would depend on necessarily how you show that it was partial.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for your time. All right, is everyone set? Let's go and get started. Fair trade and free trade are two very different conceptions of trade. Fair trade says that we ought to restrict trade in certain situations to try to stop exploitation, while free trade says that we ought to allow the free market to balance itself, essentially. And while sometimes fair trade and the difference between fair trade and free trade is painted as a difference between justice and prosperity, I don't actually agree with that. In fact, I stand with Edmund Burke that, quote, free trade is not based on utility, but on justice, end quote. I'm here today to tell you that I believe free trade is the most just thing that we can choose, the most just policy that we can choose, and therefore it should be valued above fair trade. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and agree with a lot of what my opponent said. I agree with his definitions of fair and free trade, understanding that it's a form of international trade that we're talking about, and also understanding that domestic restrictions on trade are not in conflict with free trade. I also agree with the government actor and the standard of conflict. And finally, I agree with his value, which simply means that whichever side of the resolution better upholds justice at the end of the day is the side that should win today's debate round. But I would argue that rather than fair trade, free trade best upholds justice. So with that in mind, my opponent has posed his points in the form of somewhat of a syllogism, essentially saying that here's some premises, and if these premises are all true, then the conclusion that follows is also true. So in order for me to prove that my opponent is wrong, in order for me to prove that I win today's debate round, I must disagree with one of my opponent's premises, and if I can do so and prove that that premise is wrong, then his conclusion does not necessarily follow, meaning he has not upheld the burden of proof, meaning he does not win the debate round. So in order to win today's debate round, my opponent must prove that all three of his premises are true in order for his conclusion to logically follow. Today, I will be disagreeing with two of my opponent's premises. I will disagree with his second and third premises. I think his first premise is pretty obvious. We obviously have to have impartiality in order to have justice. I'm not going to disagree with that, but I'll disagree with the other two for a couple of reasons. I'm going to start with the third premise, premise C, which he said to stop exploitation, we must uphold fair prices and fair trade. I would argue that's not the case. I'd argue that exploitation can be stopped or at least limited underneath a free trade environment, because I believe that free trade sponsors impartiality. And the number one reason why it does this is that it limits exploitation. Free trade limits exploitation, if not stop it altogether. Now, we see this through a couple main ideas. We're going to talk about comparative advantage and the invisible hand. Comparative advantage says that any nation, no matter how poor, has something that other nations want. So essentially, if each of these nations focuses on its area of expertise, it'll get better and better at producing the products, resulting in more profits. And the second, invisible hand theory, which says that when nations labor for their own interests and advantage, the resulting competition between members benefits everyone. Producers make the best and cheapest possible product to attract consumers, and consumers buy more of the products, and everyone reaps the benefits. Now, it's not true that prosperity, these theories are mainly talking about prosperity. It's not true that prosperity always stops injustice, but it is true that when nations and individuals have more money within their hands, they're less likely to be able to be exploited. Think about it. If you're very poor, it's very likely that someone could exploit you because you don't have enough money. But if you have money in your hands, then you're less likely to be able to be exploited. Now, if we think about it like this, I want to make one point about what my opponent said. My opponent is assuming that we have situations in which unfair trade exists. Essentially, situations in which people are being exploited when they're not being paid the market price. I would argue that underneath a free trade market, this would never happen. With a free trade market, we have a bunch of producers and consumers. If nations open up their trading borders, there'll be even more producers and consumers, making it even less likely that anyone will ever be exploited. Because in order for someone to be exploited, a consumer has to basically force a producer to sell a product for a price they don't want to sell it for. And if the market is open and free, that's never going to happen because there will always be another consumer for the producer to try to sell their product to. So because of that, free trade limits the exploitation that happens. Secondly, it protects rights, and this point is very simple. Free trade can protect rights by enacting domestic laws within their own country that stop exploitation that happens there. So the only exploitation we're actually talking about would be international exploitation. So essentially, we see through this point that free trade sponsors impartiality, which means that we don't necessarily have to have fair prices to take care of exploitation. If exploitation is stopped by free trade, or at least limited to a very high degree, then we don't have to have fair trade in order to stop it. Now, let me go ahead and talk about my opponent's second premise, which he said, to uphold impartiality, we must stop exploitation. Now, I would say, essentially, my opponent is committing the part-to-whole fallacy here, because he assumes that exploitation is all the impartiality that we can have. He assumes that if we stop exploitation, we will certainly have impartiality in the market. But that is not true. Exploitation is not the only form of partiality that we see in the market. It is not the only form of partiality we see in the market. There are other ways for the market to be partial that isn't exploitation. Actually, one of those forms is fair trade. One of those forms is fair trade. So fair trade and fair prices are partial as concepts. They're partial as concepts. And we see that in this situation, fair trade acts positively. Let me quote from Frederick Bastiat, a philosopher who wrote a book called The Law. He said, quote, "When law and force keep a man within the bounds of justice, they impose nothing on him but a mere negation," end quote. But he also said, quote, "When the law imposes a form of labor, it is no longer negative. It acts positively upon the men. It substitutes the will of the legislator for their own will, the will of the initiative of the legislator for their own initiative," end quote. So essentially, fair trade would have the government imposing a form of labor upon people, which forces people to sell products for more money than they want to sell them for. Think about it. If we have a minimum price, then it's very possible that products wouldn't be able to be sold on sale. If you walk into a store and a meat is nearing its due date, you can buy it for cheaper. But a minimum price would say, no, you cannot sell that product. Even if producers want to get rid of oversupply, a minimum price would make it so that they are not allowed to sell prices at that price, which ultimately takes money out of their hands, money that they could be making in profits, and gives it to others. And for that reason, free trade should be upheld above fair trade.
All right. Is everyone ready? All right, let's begin. All right. So EY, I'm really glad that we can agree on a lot of the foundational bases of really the foundations of this debate and really our end goal. So I really just want to jump in and ask you a couple questions about what you said about free trade. Okay. So first, you talked about comparative advantage in the invisible hand, correct?
Yeah.
All right. And now these concepts essentially say that when people compete and when they compete with one another for better prices and better products, everyone's prosperity is uplifted, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Now, we can agree that the way that the free market works, it essentially works off of supply and demand. That's kind of the driving force behind the prosperity in the open market.
Sure, we can agree to that.
All right. Now, you also talked a little bit about domestic exploitation is stopped by free trade. You essentially said that under free trade, we can have things that stop exploitation.
Yeah, within our own country, yes.
Right. Now, we can agree that when we're talking about the conflict between international open trade and fair trade, we're talking about a conflict that's happening on an international scale, correct?
Yeah, sure.
All right. And so we should discuss what stops international exploitation, not necessarily just domestic, correct?
Sure, we can agree to that.
All right. Now, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the concept of Bastiat in the law. And so is it essentially your argument that justice only pertains to protecting individual rights?
I wouldn't say that necessarily, but you could, if you would bring up more examples of where justice is outside of individual rights, that would be great.
Right. Okay. I'll give you a scenario. Let's say that we have a society where half of the society is very impoverished, they're very poor, and half of the society is wealthy. Now, let's say that the wealthy half of the society comes together and they agree to trade normally with one another, but systematically refuse to trade with the poor people or offer them ridiculously low prices for their goods so as to keep them poor and keep themselves wealthy. And now, in this way, the rich part of the society systematically takes advantage of the poorer half of the society, and they stay poor and they stay rich. Is this necessarily just?
I would say that's not a just situation, but as I said, I think free trade would ensure that that never happens.
Right, and now you talked a little bit about how free trade offers a lot of consumers and buyers. It's open, it's free, and so there's not a lot of opportunity for exploitation. Now, You agreed with my definition of fair trade, correct?
Sure.
All right. And so we would agree that for people in developing countries that they might not have the same open market access as someone in the United States, correct?
Well, if they don't have the open market access, then we should by all means uphold free trade to make sure that they do.
All right. Thank you. No further questions.
Okay.
All right. So is everybody ready? All right. In this first affirmative rebuttal, this second affirmative speech of the round, I'd really like to start off by establishing that my opponent and I actually agree on a lot. We agree on the definitions, the resolutional framework, and on the value. So ultimately today, the main part of this debate that we're going to disagree upon is going to be with some of the main arguments, the main points of contention. So with that, I have three main points I would like to address in this first rebuttal, starting with that of something that my opponent stated in his last speech in response to my third premise. Now, my third premise was to stop exploitation, we would essentially need to uphold fair trade. Now, my opponent disagreed with this statement, and he stated a couple things under this. One of the things that my opponent stated is that ultimately free trade upholds prosperity, allows for comparative advantage in the invisible hand, theories that essentially say that when we compete and when we have open, free markets, we can compete in such a way that everyone's prosperity is uplifted. And my opponent further postulated that the more prosperous we are, the more wealthy we are, the more able we are to really protect ourselves from exploitation. Now, I have three things to say in response to this. The first is that my opponent is assuming that everyone plays by the rules. My opponent is assuming that we're talking about people competing legitimately. But one of the things you'll notice about my last speech is that I talked about when people are not offering a fair price, when they're not talking about supply and demand, when they're not offering a price that resembles competition, it will actually not only be unjust, but this undermines my opponent's entire assumption of prosperity. If people refuse to go by what the market says and instead go off of seeking opportunity to exploit, then competition will not work in this way. And the invisible hand won't necessarily bring people out of poverty. Comparative advantage won't necessarily ensure that people are not exploited. Now, secondly, my opponent, by saying this, is essentially assuming that having a lack of regulation will lead to nobody exploiting anybody else, because he stated that the more buyers and consumers there are, people have multiple options. So if someone tries to exploit you, you can essentially refuse and wait for someone else to come along. But once again, my opponent is assuming the position of the people who are being exploited. I'd like to point you back to my definition of fair trade, which my opponent agreed upon. And in that situation, in that definition, what we're looking at are situations where people in developing countries are trying to get fair prices. Now, if you are an impoverished coffee farmer in Costa Rica, what that means is that you're not only poor, but you don't have the same commercial access as somebody as such, say, a big corporation in a developed country. And even if my opponent, as he said, even if we opened up free trade, as we have been doing, ultimately, that does not give them better market access. It ultimately just says that they can buy and sell from whom they want. But if that's the case, and a corporation comes in and tries to exploit them, take advantage of their situation, knowing that they don't have many buyers and many opportunities, exploitation could still occur. Therefore, prosperity, which my opponent is postulating, is actually undermined if people commit exploitation. It would not result in legitimate competition. Secondly, the poor people, the people we're talking about, don't necessarily have the same market access. And so, as my opponent stated, free trade would not necessarily stop exploitation from ever happening. And now, third and finally, I'd like to talk about this part to whole fallacy. Now, my opponent stated that essentially fair trade does not stop all exploitation. I would say that it would stop international exploitation. Once again, we're not talking about shutting down the international market. I'm not talking about stopping trade, stopping competition, or stopping prosperity. I'm talking about stopping exploitation on an international level. And ultimately, I believe that exploitation happens far more often to these people, and that we need to stop that if we want to uphold justice.
You said? All right, let's go ahead and get started. Really, this debate has come down to this. Which side better upholds justice through impartiality? Which side is better upholds impartiality by stopping exploitation? And to answer that question, we're going to be looking at a couple different points. since I'm the neg, I'm going to go and use as the points my opponent's second and third premises. I want to address each of these in turn and show why they're still incorrect. So first, talking about his second premise, premise B, in which he said, to uphold impartiality, we must stop exploitation. Now let me explain a little bit more what I meant by saying that he was committing the part to whole fallacy. Here's essentially what I'm saying. My opponent is sort of assuming by saying this that every form of partiality comes through exploitation. That every form of partiality that we could see happening within a market comes through exploitation. And I'm simply saying that's not the case. I'm saying there are other ways for governments, for people to be partial within the market. There are other ways to do that other than just exploitation. If you really want to think about exploitation and partiality as the same thing, then we just see that both of these things happen within the market. And it's not just situations in which consumers are paying unfair prices to producers that are situations of exploitation and partiality. There are other situations. And one of those, as I stated before, is fair trade. I would say that fair trade is partial in and of itself. Let me explain a little bit more what I mean by that. But first, let me quote Bastiat. And I didn't get to this quote in my last speech, but I want to quote him now. In the law, he says, quote, "The law can only be an instrument of equalization as far as it takes from one party to give to another, and then it is an instrument of plunder," end quote. Essentially, what Bastiat is saying is that the law has to use force. That's the only thing that the law can use. And so essentially, if the law is going to equalize the economy, they have to get their money from somewhere. The government has to get their money from somewhere. So if the government wants to make sure that these poor people are getting more money for their products, that money is going to have to come from somewhere else. And that place just might be the consumer's pockets. And that's okay. Again, if it is true what my opponent says, if it is true that it is happening, that people are being completely exploited and that they aren't being paid the wages of supply and demand, then it might be the case that we might need fair trade. But as I'll argue later, I don't believe that's actually happening, which leaves us here under the situation of fair trade, assuming that that's not going to be what's going to be happening. What's happening is that the minimum price is being set, and people who aren't necessarily being exploited, but are trying to sell below the supply and demand price, are not able to sell for that price. Essentially, what a minimum price would do is that, aside from the situations where people are being exploited and they aren't being paid the supply and demand price, it would basically cause consumer or producers not to be able to sell their products for a lower price than they might want to sell it for. Say, for example, a producer makes too many apples and wants to sell them lower than the market price. Well, the minimum price might say they can't sell the products for that price. They can't sell those apples, and so the apple producer is left with a bunch of extra apples that they can't sell because they're not allowed to sell them for cheaper. Or, for example, if a grocery store is trying to sell meat because it's going to go out of date that day, it's not allowed to make that transaction because the minimum price won't allow it to. Because the government can't see into every individual situation. It cannot tell that each individual transaction, whether or not that's an example of exploitation, as my opponent says, or if it's just an example of someone trying to fairly sell products below the minimum price or the fair price that fair trade would set. And so essentially what we see here is that when it comes down to the situations in which fair trade is being enacted in the real world, we can see that even if it were to stop this exploitation, which may or may not be occurring, and we'll get to that later, even if it were to do that, it would also have the side effect of causing producers not to be able to not sell products for what they might want to sell them for. And essentially, if the producer has to sell products for a high price, not only are they being treated partially because they are not allowed to sell prices below what they want to sell them for, but also consumers are being treated partially because they now have to pay more money for products that might previously have been less. Essentially, the government is going to discriminate against products that are being fairly sold for low prices in a fair fashion. The government would discriminate against those transactions and say that they were not fair, which ultimately is being partial. So in this way, we see that fair trade is not necessarily a situation of exploitation, but it is a situation in which people aren't being entirely partial. We aren't treating producers and consumers equally, we aren't giving them equal opportunity because there are certain prices that they're not allowed to sell their product for. And in that way, we see that this premise is false because it assumes the part-to-whole fallacy and assumes that every single situation of impartiality is going to be a situation of exploitation. So moving on to my opponent's third premise, and I would just disagree with what he said regarding this. He said that I assume that everyone plays by the rules. Now, I'm not necessarily assuming that, but what I said earlier in my last speech was that free trade makes sure that these situations of exploitation don't even happen. If we don't have to ensure that everyone's playing by the rules. If we open up trade, then there are always going to be another consumer or another producer to go to if you aren't getting the price you want. There won't be exploitation. We don't have to ensure that people aren't playing by the rules. If we open up the market, even the poor will have more situations in which they can trade, in which they can buy. And for that reason, I believe that free trade ought to be upheld above fair trade.
I have 1 minute of prep time remaining, starting now. All right, is everybody ready? All right. Am I ready? All right, then let's get started. All right, in this 2AR, the second affirmative rebuttal, this last speech of the round, I'd really like to hammer on the most important points for us to take away today. I'd like to start off by pointing you back to the syllogism I provided in my first speech. My first premise. In order to uphold justice, we must uphold impartiality. In order to uphold justice, we must uphold impartiality. And once again, I would say, it is unjust to be partial. It is unjust to show favoritism, and it is unjust for people to exploit and take advantage of one another in such a way that they are no longer equal. And because of that, that leads to my second premise. In order to uphold impartiality, we must stop exploitation. In order to uphold impartiality, we must stop exploitation. I think it goes without saying that if somebody is truly exploiting and taking advantage of another person, then they are committing an action and is no longer giving them the equal respect and opportunity that everybody else has. And when that happens, when that person is committing exploitation, impartiality is no longer being upheld. In fact, someone is actually removing that person's equal standing in society for their own gain. And that leads to the third premise. In order to stop exploitation, we must uphold fair trade and fair prices. Once again, I point you back to what I said in my very first speech. We have a choice today. When fair trade and free trade come into conflict, we must choose one. If we choose to side with free trade and leave the market unrestricted and uphold it over fair trade, a fair price will not be paid. If a fair price, what we would consider reasonable according to the economy, if that price is not being paid, then that is exploitation. Now, there are a couple of things that my opponent has said in regard to this syllogism. My opponent said in response to my second premise, my premise stating that to be impartial, we essentially have to stop exploitation. Now, my opponent stated that exploitation is not the only form of partiality. And one of the things that my opponent said is that fair trade would essentially attempt to equalize the economy and make consumers have to pay more to the producers. Now, once again, I would like to establish the fact that I'm not talking about controlling or shutting down the economy. I think that a fair and reasonable price is based off of the market price, based off of what market and supply and demand prices say is reasonable. Because of that, when I'm talking about forcing people to pay a fair price, what I'm talking about is saying if you want to buy this product, you have to pay a price that the current market would reasonably consider that price to be worth. I'm not talking about artificially raising prices. I'm talking about simply instituting and enforcing supply and demand. And ultimately, my opponent has talked about a lot of things about how prosperity will lift all boats. But prosperity in the invisible hand in the economy will not work if people are not legitimately competing through exploitation. Ultimately, if we want to uphold justice, we must side with fair trade and ensure fair prices. Thank you.